wanted to go ahead and say, are we ready to get going? Do we want to roll on with our presentation? Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our event. And today we're going to be talking about the Deaf Fulbright experience. And I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Jameson, and this is my sign name. And right now I am a graduate student working in the education abroad here at Gallaudet. And I'm going to let you know a little bit about what's going on with this and the logistics for this webinar. Now, this is going to be recorded, and everyone who may have missed this, it will be posted to our Gallaudet site, and we will send out that link. Okay, and if anyone has any questions or any comments that they would like to make, we ask that you hold those until the end, and then you can come on camera and sign your questions, or you can alternatively put your questions into the chat. And we do have voice interpreting services, and that is good and ready to go. And now I'd like to introduce our two panelists. And first we have Jarvis, and secondly, Rachel. And this is Rachel's son. That's your sign name, right? So I will allow each of you to introduce yourselves. Jarvis.
Good evening. My name is Jarvis Grindstaff. Are we going to go ahead and talk about our experience, or what are we doing right now?
Well, talk about who you are and what work you've done.
Okay. I am Jarvis Grindstaff. I live in Washington, D.C. I work at Gallaudet University in the Academic Affairs Office. I graduated Gallaudet with a master's program in international development, my MPA.
All right, great. Rachel.
Good evening. I graduated Gallaudet a very long time ago, back in 1995, with a bachelor's in ASL, and then ended up coming back to work at Gallaudet several years later, and I'm the department chair this fall for Gallaudet University.
Very nice, very nice. So I do have some interview questions that I'd like to ask you. And this is going to be asking about your experience as a Fulbright scholar. But first, let's talk a little bit about what the Fulbright scholarship is. So this is given to people to study in other countries and do research for either 9 to 10 months. And studying for 9 months, it's a really competitive scholarship, and it's a long process to go through the application to then be picked to go to another country to study. So the first question that I have is, which countries did you go to for your Fulbright experience, and what was your research? What did you focus on? So who wants to go first? Jarvis?
I don't mind going first if Rochelle doesn't have a preference. I did my research in Thailand, and they had a sign for Fulbright over there, which was this. I saw Jameson's sign, and that comes from the government funds that sponsor you to go.
Nice.
I researched communication technology for the deaf in Thailand and looked at some of the technology they had. They also have video remote interpreting. They've had that for 6 or 8 years at this time. And I researched the impact that had on the Thailand deaf community. A lot of the deaf individuals were stakeholders in terms of setting that up. They realized that individuals weren't able to afford this service as they could a regular phone service, and looked at other countries and models to establish video relay services in Thailand.
Very nice. Thai's video relay service as a research topic. That's awesome. Okay, Rachel?
So I did my Fulbright in Italy. And this was actually their sign that I was using. They call it Italia, but we call it Italy here in the United States. And this was, gosh, almost 23 years ago that I did this, back in '98. I was there for 5 months. And I don't know that I would call what I was doing for my project research, but I was working with facilitating information between the United States and Canada as a sign language teacher, and Italy, Italian sign language teachers. So I worked with RCS, so I did curriculum and looked at how they were structured differently. We looked at their assessment systems in Italy and really set up a profitable organization for licensure, certification, and accreditation of who is allowed to teach sign language in Italy. So I brokered that between the United States and the Americas, really, and Italy. So it was a lot of fun.
Nice, nice. So you were there for 5 months, correct?
Yes.
And okay, Jarvis, how long were you in Thailand?
Just over 6 months. I planned to do my full 10 months there, but with the pandemic spreading around the world, I had to get back to the United States before I was stuck. I did visit China for a little bit while I was doing research and looked into their VRS system as well. And that was back in November when all of this started over there. I was in the Chenghu, which is right next to Wuhan province. I used the sign for Wuhan, sorry, Rochelle. So I was right next door to the Wuhan province where the pandemic started. And Thailand is just to the other side of the border from that. There's China, then Vietnam, then Thailand. And Thailand had the highest tourist rate at the time, and a lot of people were coming through during the beginning of the pandemic. But surprisingly, they've had very little breakout in terms of infection rates because they follow social distancing. They were already into using masks. And so I tried to follow all of their rules, and it was very easy, very much like the United States, but less resistance. But I ended up being called back to the States because of that. And COVID here is much higher than it was in Thailand, so it's a little bit weird that I had to come back to the States, but that's why my research was cut short.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. You know, I'm sure that was tough to have to experience that coming back earlier than expected.
Yeah, and I would like to finish my research project and publish in a journal and make it actually its own journal, hopefully. That was the goal. I had just begun the data collection part when I had to come back to the States. I can continue doing data collection from the States, but it's a little bit harder. So that was a missed opportunity for the time being, but I do hope to go back someday and finish it.
Yeah, I hope that you're able to do that someday as well. Okay, so next question that I have for you. I'm wondering, why is it you decided to apply for the Fulbright scholarship? Did you have any international experience previous to applying, any travel, anything that applied to your decision to move forward?
Before I had done my Fulbright, I had gone to the Deaf Olympics. And I had been to a couple other countries as well, Switzerland for the Olympics as well. And that was a really good experience. My senior spring at Gallaudet, I went to South America before I was in Fulbright. So when I did my graduate studies at Gallaudet University, that's when Fulbright came onto my radar. It was nothing I had heard of before. So I was really intrigued by it. And there were really 3 of us that applied. Well, I mean, obviously there were other people across the United States and world that did it, but I won from Gallaudet. And I got there to Italy first. The other 2 arrived in the fall. So there was a little bit of overlap. I think there was another part to your question that I don't know if I answered or not.
Well, did you have any experiences that impacted you to consider applying for the Fulbright?
Okay, so that's right, thank you. I was doing my master's in linguistics at the time. I was also teaching ASL, and it just felt right. I feel like anyone who's teaching a language should experience what it's like to learn another language. And so I was doing that throughout my Fulbright. So I learned what it felt like to take classes and how overwhelming it was to learn another language. So I really wanted to put myself in my students' shoes so that I could have that experience. And it was just amazing. I remember how much in the beginning my eyes would hurt from learning a new language, how much my brain would hurt from processing a new language, and then learning to read and write Italian was a lot of work, and it was exhausting. And I remember how many misunderstandings I had in the beginning. So it was an interesting experience moving out to Italy, but it really helped me gain empathy for what it means to be a student of another language. Even though it was a new sign language, I also learned reading and written.
Absolutely.
Italian. And it was just an amazing experience. And when I saw the promotion for Fulbright, I just felt like I had to do it so I could be a better teacher, a better human being, and contribute to improving the world. So that's why I applied.
Yeah, that's a good point. Putting yourselves in another person's shoes as they're trying to acquire language. Yeah, I totally understand. So Jarvis.
So I'm gonna try and answer both of those questions at the same time. When I was doing my MPA in international development, I was doing some research on Thailand. And I had done that actually before my MPA as an undergrad student. And I just wanted to experience what it felt like to get out of the country and go to another place on earth. And so I decided to go to Thailand because of a staff member who had been to Thailand before and told me about their experience going to a school for the deaf, a residential school in northern Thailand. And that was my first time working outside of the country, was going there. And I went there for a summer and taught at the school for the deaf. And I remember there was a big blue doorway that the students would go through. And it was a big, large booth, to clarify. And students would use that to call their parents, order food, and they would use that to call their parents to pick them up to go home for the weekend. And that's the first experience I had with VRS in another country. And I really wanted to learn more about that. So that was my first experience before. And then I ended up getting into graduate school. And I was working on communication technology, specifically VRS, not just in the US, but around the world. And I recalled my experience in Thailand at the School for the Deaf. And I just felt like I was about ready to graduate, but I wasn't done with school. I wanted to continue doing research. And based on my knowledge and observations, there's not a lot of research in that field. But I wasn't sure how to fund the research that I wanted to do. And I remember I'd heard about the Fulbright. I saw a new advertisement for it, and I looked into what that program was, and I decided that it was time to go ahead and apply. And I ended up getting it, which was great.
Wow, that's nice. I didn't know that Thailand had their own VRS system. That's interesting. So my next question, I would say, what was the largest challenge that you faced during your research time in another country through your studies? What challenges presented themselves?
Oh. One of the big challenges was working with the university there. Working in their system and their educational culture, which is very different than that of the United States. Anytime I would be out in the field, there was always things that would come up that I wouldn't predict and that I couldn't foresee that impacted my research and ended up pushing it back. I know Gallaudet's system, I know the IRB system in the United States, and I know who to talk to here, but I wasn't sure at the other university. We were communicating basically completely electronically, and because of some of the language barriers between me and Thailand, it caused some confusion and some issues. They don't really have IRB in the same way that we do. They're similar to RIT, if I can compare it to that. This university I was at was sort of like NTID, National Technical Institute for the Deaf, which is a school at the Rochester Institute of Technology. And there was not a lot of electronic communications. I would have to print out my papers, give it to the teacher, and just like they did in old school grading, I would get it back with red corrections and everything on it, which threw me back. And it seemed like they were a little bit reticent to work with an American student. I'm not sure exactly why. I tried to be as respectful as possible as a visiting student. So those were some of the challenges. Anything else, or Rachel?
Yeah, thank you. Rachel?
My color's a little bit off since, okay, there we go. Better, sorry. Well, I was one of the first students from Gallaudet to go through the Fulbright experience. There wasn't really a system for us at that time. A lot of it was on our own, and even more to the fact, I went on my own before the other two students arrived. And I remember shortly before heading out, people were always teasing me, telling me what not to bring, specific things. But I started seeing a common item that I guess people would tell you not to bring places from everyone. If you can think about
it, your passport?
Well, you have to have your passport to go to another country, but it was something related to Italian culture. Just wondering if y'all can guess it. They told me not to bring a watch. And I kept hearing that from everyone. And the first time I blew it off, and then I heard it again, so I started to consider it, and then I kept hearing it. And back in 1998, what was I gonna bring? There was no internet. I had to bring books. I had to communicate with my family via fax in the late 90s. There was no social media, no internet there. We didn't have video relay service. We didn't have cell phones. And I lived with an Italian family that was deaf. And the two brothers were deaf. The older brother had come to the United States as a Fulbright scholar, so he'd already had that experience. And he knew some American Sign Language from being in the States for a year, but I arrived, met my deaf family, who I hadn't met before, right? And we headed back to their apartment. And I started talking with the older brother, and he said, I'm only going to use American Sign Language with you today, day one. After that, Italian Sign Language all the way, or LIS is what they call it. Gesturing and LIS is what we use the entire time. Since day two, moving forward, my entire time there. I did have an interpreter for some of my studies. I did learn LIS, or Italian Sign Language. And it was hard. There was no internet. We could go and access the internet in the middle of the community. There was a communal cafe that had internet, but we didn't want to do that because it was not an easy trek. I don't know about
And they still have those in Thailand. They sure do.
Yeah, with internet and everything, or?
Yeah, mostly it's used for gaming, but yeah, they are still available there.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, so they were called internet cafes. And they had everything, stores, like I said, a cafe, internet, and everything was in Italian. Everything was written in Italian. There was nothing in English. It's not like today where we have full computers in our hand that can Google Translate. And I had to figure everything out from scratch. I remember the old TTYs that they had there that we were able to use. And it was just an immersive experience. And I wasn't prepared in the beginning. And I ended up getting very comfortable with Italian Sign Language, or LIS. And I was telling people that I was visiting from America, and they all said, oh, they said that I had a natural accent, that I didn't look like I had learned sign language in just the 6 months I was there, but it's because I lived with a deaf family. About 2 months into my time there, I met someone who was deaf, who knew American Sign Language for the first time since I had gotten there, and I was elated. I cried because I was so excited to use my native sign language. But even about 5 minutes into that, we switched back to Lise. It was a challenge working between two languages, but it really made me grow. I became a much better person. I became more flexible. I became more open-minded. I mean, there was one bathroom that we all shared in the same house. I slept in the living room on the couch. They would sleep in their rooms. I sort of felt like I was being monitored because I was in the public room. But it was just an amazing experience. And that was 22 years ago, but I still talk about it to this day. It's an amazing experience. A challenge, but still a good experience.
The interpreters are now going to switch where they are interpreting for. So you asked why I shouldn't bring a watch. You know, well, when I was getting there, I was getting ready to work. That's why I was coming to Italy. So, in thinking about schedules and such, I was like, how do you keep to a schedule if you have no way to tell time? And my boss just kind of shrugged it off. So I was trying to figure out, I was like, where's my workspace? Where's my office? And again, I just met with this shrug off. And instead, I get this, hey, come on over here, let's have an espresso. And, you know, people are just smoking outside of cafes and they're not really in a hurry. There's a lot of discussion that is occurring in regards to work, but nobody's really rushed or in a hurry. So if you're scheduled to meet someone sometime, somewhere, I was told to just let go, you know, it's okay. So I started to become a lot more go with the flow, and the siesta in the afternoon. You know, do you know what that is? That's like a break, like 3 hours. You eat lunch later in the afternoon than typically here in the United States. And then you finish work around 8 o'clock, and then your dinner typically is around 10 p.m. at night, which was a little off-putting for me to begin with. I did like the very laid-back pace, and you know, folks there live longer, so yeah. Well, and this is Jarvis, and I forgot to mention one thing that came to mind. In Thailand, at the university that I was working with, the system and the culture is different. Specifically, when you arrive there, some may have this already in mind, some may not, but they're used to hearing folk because they think, oh, a deaf person? No, they've just never heard of that. That's never occurred to them. So there were some people that had already been assigned to my research that were hearing, and then of course communication broke down. So in Thailand, hearing parents of deaf children have them in hearing schools, and when there really should be a deaf school type setup. But at the university there, they did have a few deaf students there. However, they didn't have the experience of a researcher coming in. So I think that was really good for everyone to be able to learn from each other. I was able to teach them and they were able to teach me. And it was really a challenge because, again, communication was just not there. We did have interpreters, however, you know, for the research, but for the actual sit downs in the meetings, there was no interpretation. So there were a lot of communication challenges that occurred during that time. And I think it really was good for them to be able to learn that deaf people can do those things, and they learned that from me. And after I left, they did bring up some of the information. I believe it's, you know, some of the instructors, they're not called professors there, they're instructors because of what they've gotten to. But they're seeing that indeed those instructors could come to the US and study and do research. That's something they'd never known before. So I gave them the contact information for the Thailand Fulbright office to see how maybe that could go. And I'm hopeful to see if maybe they come and visit.
It's nice to have that exposure to deaf academics.
And Rachel's saying, absolutely. And if I could add one thing, finances was really a struggle because you get room and board, from your scholarship funds, but how can I cash the check that I received for my stipend? And I had to get in country and then kind of ask around. And they said, you can go to the bank. And I went up to the bank and they were like, it's a deaf person. And then they tried to write back and forth with me in Italian. And I didn't know what their word was for bank. So I remember really having to say, okay, I would show them the check. And, I gestured that I want to put this check in and take out money incrementally, not the entire amount, but just some. And, through the gestures, there was communication that happened. And I mean, I was floored. I really was, because the culture relies so strongly on gesturing. So in talking with a hearing Italian person, it's different because they do include that, and things work themselves out. And like my visa would not allow me to establish a bank account. So there was a lot of back and forth over that. And we found another way to be able to establish that account and then deposit my money and then withdraw it as necessary. But the gesturing was so big. Jarvis, did they have the gesturing in Thailand? And Jarvis is saying, really, it was really tough because their body language was not the same. Oftentimes there were very simple gestures, just like cup or drink, that kind of blew their minds a little bit. And say if you had a white person, they haven't seen many white people, but their reaction to the situation was different, because oftentimes seeing our facial expressions, to them it appeared crazy. So then they would laugh, thinking I was trying to be funny with my odd behavior and such. So that's what I focused on. They laughed at me a lot, even at little simple things. Maybe something was spoken and then, that happened. But yeah, with the bank situation, yeah, that's right. I remember when I arrived, I got the same check. And right, Fulbright, the system gives it to you, and that's all they do. And then I think there was about a total of 6 Fulbright researchers that were there, and 5 of them were there on their own. And there's one deaf person. They're like, oh, because you're a deaf person, we'll assign somebody to come help and speak for you. And that was the first time that I'd had that experience of, oh, somebody thinks they have to do things for me, because I'm used to being self-sufficient. I can do these things myself, write back and forth, communicate, whatever. But, this was the first time this happened. It was kind of mind-blowing. So I was given a phone number and a phone, and worked all this out. So I was like, okay. They looked for an apartment for me, and they made all the calls, and they're like, do you like this place? We took a look at it and helped to choose the apartment. So yeah, that was interesting.
That sort of gets into our next question. What was communication access like for you? I know Rachel said that you were 24/7 because of that family, immersed in at least in Italian Sign Language and learning that. But can you talk a little bit more about your experience with learning the language?
Yeah, pretty much, oftentimes it was really a wake-up call, and I was using lease all the time. Eat, sleep, breathe, lease. It was that all the time. And it was baptism by fire, I tell you. But honestly, and looking back, I really preferred that approach, because I am a person, for Fulbright, of course, there were 3 of us that were going, but in Italy, there's this very interesting geography, and then you've got the islands and such. But at first I was in the northern part, and then later in Sicily. So when you see all of that, and also Milan, so it's in different places. And I don't know if you know this, but most of Europe tends to close down for a month during August. And this family had a beach home in Sicily. And so in doing that, I mean, there's just these little small cottages, but to be able to experience that, we're out talking all night, we're talking about the mafia, bombings and all these types of things. I've got lots of stories, and the trains, and some people explain their really terrible experiences. But one thing I found out is that the mafia really, really cherishes deaf people because they can't rat them out. Yeah, so oftentimes mafia would employ people who are deaf. But the point of that is that in Sicily, we were there for a month, but the sign language was a little bit different. Well, no, it was pretty different, actually. So here I was learning this all over again. And then when I went to Rome for 2 months, that's when the other two Fulbright scholars arrived. And then the three of us were together. So the three of us shared an apartment in Rome. And at that point, we realized our differences because I had picked up all of this language. And then when they got there, they had to then start that process of learning lease. And they were looking at me like, wow, okay, oh, you know, so it was very interesting, their journey compared to mine. But the three of us used ASL to be able to communicate. But we were tempted to use ASL often, but we had to force ourselves. But when we were with the family, we absolutely had to use lease. So, and as we traveled the country, that really helped us to form our education on the different languages and dialects. So we did take classes, but it was interesting. I think it's really important to get experiences of people out there, you know, and it wasn't one of those things where we could FaceTime or anything else like that. So we couldn't FaceTime people around the country. It just wasn't an option, or around the world. And I wanted to, this is Jarvis, I wanted to mention too that when I joined my host family, and as I mentioned, when I got there, they had already decided they had found maybe it was 5 different apartments. And so we went and looked. And so I just kind of followed what they said and was like, okay, and looked at all of these different places and the rent and such, and finally picked a place. And then later, I regretted that. I should have said, I can do this myself, or I could sleep in the dorm by myself and done that. And the commute, I mean, it wasn't terrible, but you know, they did have a metro system. It was kind of cool to be able to go into the city, figure out how to get to the university on my own. But at the same time, if I was out, you know, did people feel like they needed to let me know about things? You know, I think that maybe Fulbright could maybe make arrangements for people to sleep on campus. And maybe there's some type of program there at the university where you can interact with the students, say eat in the cafeteria, and just really get into that experience. I think that would have been better. But if I were to do it again, I think I would have preferred to slept on campus. And Rachel saying, yeah, I fully support that. And Jameson, what was your question?
How did you access communication?
Well, and this is Jarvis. I studied some Thai Sign Language before I got there. There was a summer internship for school, and I was able to communicate the basics, like your everyday visual types of things. And then because of the time period between that, I think it was 3 months, I started to lose what I had learned, but I picked it right back up as soon as I started using it. And one thing, when it comes to academic research, I still didn't feel comfortable interviewing someone in Thai Sign Language because I felt like it could lead to some missing information. So I decided to ask for an interpreter, and they can provide interpreting services. Say if a person is hearing, then a Thai Sign Language interpreter, and then it would be interpreted again into International Sign Language. So I wasn't able to use that in full-on ASL, but we did have some folks that knew Justino, or International Sign Language. And ASL and International Sign Language are kind of a mix of the same signs. So during the interview, I was able to look at the TSL, and if it wasn't clear, the academic terminology, then we were able to look at that. And it seemed to work pretty well. And some of the other interviews, we just used TSL entirely. And it was fun. It was fun to see that, because the history of TSL, really, it's based on an old version of ASL that has been adapted to the more local. So the foundation of ASL is there. So I would assume maybe an American went over there and brought that, and maybe an American that comes over could understand TSL. Like like the signs for have are just a little bit different. So I was able to catch that when it was being signed. And there were some other differences as well, but yeah, that was my experience. So what about the presidential, is that done? Because we knew about a deaf group there. Yeah, right. Both were from Gallaudet and did a lot of active organizing and such, and we knew each other. And this is Jarvis, right? So the Fulbright actually had two sponsorships. So they have at least one, but they have two. There's the university, and then there's another, kind of like the one that's like NTID, and then there's the deaf agency. So they sponsor two opportunities. So yeah, with the president, we saw that pretty often. We were able to join and see speeches and such to see how that worked. So I was able to set up some interviews there, but again, I wasn't able to complete those because I had to return to the States because of the pandemic. But on an annual basis, people do return there for those events. So yeah.
Wonderful. So let's move on to the next question. What advice would you give to students that are looking for a Fulbright experience or looking to apply for the research grant?
That's a good question.
And if you could also talk a little bit about what the application process looks like.
So this is Jarvis. Really, now for the application process, I would strongly recommend that you start as early as humanly possible, because the timeline, it does take a long time to gather the materials, especially the more polished and edited they are, they're also better to submit. And what I did was I decided, I 3 or 4 professors that I wanted to ask for feedback on my materials. And one of them was for the technology assistance program here at Gallaudet. So I got their ideas and perspective on the language there and what I wanted to look like. Also in international development, I asked for their feedback. And there were actually 2 in international development. And I wanted 2 because I wanted the different feedbacks. So I wanted to make sure to send them to the right person and the right people, because I don't know the background of the individual that will be reviewing this. So all of the people that I asked for help had a better understanding, instead of me going down one way, which was not what they were looking for, especially if we're talking about the complexities of terminology and such. So in passing my application around, I had enough time to gather and garner that feedback. And then secondly, too, as you're going through the process, true, but also think about your research topic. And you really want to have maybe something that you've already worked on before, so that you have a knowledge base as opposed to starting from scratch all over again. So most that are picked for international, I think it depends on the topic, of course, but if you can be as specific, but you also want to have some open options. Look at your regions, Asia, Africa. Look at the statistics that are available, and also look at the statistics of how many people are applying to those areas and how many are picked. It may be that if you look at something very specific with a smaller number, you might have a bigger chance. Like the Philippines, I noticed, as they are working with their video relay service, getting it up and running, that was very interesting. In Vietnam as well, they're in the process. So in looking at all of those, you can see how many applications there were last year, the statistics, and how many were accepted. And if there is a remarkably small number that is accepted, but a high number that are sent in, then it's not likely that you'll get chosen. But if there's a good number of accepted, then that may be where you want to be looking. And in my opinion, people think, of course, it is highly competitive. Think about France. You got 300, 400 applications for 2 slots, which is, yeah, that's a pretty small number. So that's something to keep in mind. Beautiful. And this is Rachel. My advice would be, well, it's a little bit outdated because, of course, I did this 23 years ago. but I only applied to one, Italy. So there were options, but that's where I went. So, and all the applicants that went in for that. Remember, the paperwork is insane. It is a huge stack, and you had to do a lot of filling this out. And I passed mine around for feedback a lot as well, and had a lot of people involved. And I was fortunate for having that opportunity. And I remember when I was kind of on the fence about my topic. It could be this or it could be that. So the discussion helped me to narrow my framing. And I remember at that time discussing, because here in the US, typically, or the habit was that helper model. You need to change to, meet our standards. And that was really, really terribly wrong. And, we have the resources, we have these things here. So the pushback on that. So that led to me framing the exchange of resources and then bringing those back to the US. What was I bringing back from Italy, and how could we then incorporate my experience, and what could I provide to them? And if they decide to use it, that's totally up to them. That's okay if they don't, because again, the culture is different. It's much different. So they're much more open-minded. And the number one thing about Italy, I think, is that you have to remember flexibility is key. And I really, really wish I had had the advice on studying the language more before I went. I was like, oh, I got time, I have time. But in taking a lease class, I just didn't do that. And I flew over. I wish that I'd had more of that pre-knowledge before I got there. So if anyone is thinking about applying, make sure that you really study up more on the languages there and see what you can pick up. Now, I have a good excuse. It was 1998, so there weren't really what you would consider plenty of resources to really take advantage of. That is actually quite limited. So now you have the internet, you've got video conferencing. So I think it's much different. But the point is to learn as much language as you can before you go. And I think maybe, I don't know, Jarvis, does it require that you know at least a little bit, or the basics of the languages that you're going to? Is that a Fulbright requirement now? And this is Jarvis. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Becca might know the answer to that.
Right. And it may not be all countries have the same language rules and requirements. Like some don't have any requirements, some require a lot. But what I've noticed is that most of it has to do more with, and it's hard to explain it, for the alphabet that's used, such as in Spain or Italy. It's important to know that. But if you're thinking about Chinese or Thai, which is all character based, that's not so much a requirement. However, for a deaf person, it is encouraged that you try to learn some of their sign language. Not so sure if it's a must, but yeah. Now, I do remember in China, there was a requirement, which I thought was quite surprising. But again, it varies depending on the country. This is Rachel. Right. One thing, too, when I arrived in Italy, I really wanted people to come up to me and want to learn ASL. But the message would have been like, oh, the US is better. This is Italy and your language is not as good, which is not what I wanted to do. They were like, Lis is bellissima. It's beautiful. So instead, we were going the other way around. So I remember that back in 1998, when I went to a specific place and this happened, I was able to see a very famous person there in Italy, shake their hand. I had seen their posters, but I had to kind of step back and say, well, is ASL better? No, because we used one hand for numbers and letters, whereas Italy, they would use different hands, or two hands to form the same type of concept that we would do on one hand. And they were coming right back and saying, well, ours is more beautiful. Look at how, you just using your one hand. So I was like, okay. I started to notice how they cherish their language and the culture there really loved it. They wanted to learn about it, but it's probably their third, fourth, or fifth languages that they were adding to their thing. And I wasn't trying to disenfranchise them or try to really push ASL out as a higher ideal. That wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to cherish their language as well. And you know, I don't want there to be this big push that ASL is the best. And Jarvis is saying, I'd like to add to that, that when I arrived in Thailand, at the university there, they seemed to be more aware of my research, but the deaf agency did not know in depth. So when I came in to sign a presentation, it became a bit more clear for them. And now, does that mean that I would go do research on their video relay system, saying it was lousy or such, that I would help them to develop and improve that? I was like, no, that is not the point of my research. It's just, I of course would love to see it succeed. That's wonderful. Look at all these things that have already happened, you know, and to really encourage people to learn from their own successes. So they didn't understand, you know, I didn't want to come and criticize them and tell them what was wrong. That was not my goal there. So that was kind of eye-opening in noticing that. So that was really impactful to me. So I wanted to let them know that, no, I'm not there to criticize or to improve, but rather to learn from them, or to say that their VRS system is lousy and needs to be thrown out. No, no, no. Or to say that the United States was better, you know, to say Convo was better, or some of these different providers. That was not my goal in going there, because they did have a good system on their own. They've got a great app. So there's a TTY app even. And the internet, if it were to get a little sketchy, then you could go to TTY, and then you can also have, I mean, there are all kinds of things, and interpreters there were able to do this video remote. So that's one thing that I really took to heart in learning that.
Yeah, I think it is important to encourage the places we go to still value and care about their languages and cultures, not that Americans are coming in to try and fix everything.
Sorry, my camera color went crazy again, sorry.
We have one more question before turning it over to audience Q&A. I'll give us all a chance to look at the chat box.
Hey, Charles. So Kara, yeah, go ahead, Dennis.
Kara earlier in the chat asked if we knew how many deaf or hard of hearing scholars have received a Fulbright. I don't know off the top of my head, but we know that there is a strong history of deaf and hard of hearing scholars getting and winning these Fulbright scholarships.
Well, and this is Jarvis, and now at Gallaudet, the networking has really improved, and I see that there's a lot longer of a list of alumni Fulbright scholars. So it is there. It may, and the exact number I'm not sure, but you can see who they are. So I think that's one place to take a look. And Rachel saying, in my time, while I was in Italy, I knew 2 people, but every year people would be going, and it was different folk. And I think that folks from Italy have also come here, and oftentimes when that happened, the folks at Gallaudet would ask me to come over, and they would, because I had that experience. So I wanted to help them have that experience, and then out in this deaf world in the United States, myself as a deaf person, and you know, everyone is a deaf person, and for them to have that cultural exchange. Hey, Kara. Oh, my camera, goodness. I don't know what's going on with that. I wish it would just stay with the right color. Oh, it's back again. Okay. And this is Jarvis. For the Fulbright, it's very flexible because they have lots of different programs. There's the program in which you go teach English as a second language, and they provide scholarship for that. And the most popular Fulbright is that one. The second would be research. Well, actually, yes, the second is research. It's a research award grant, and that's the one that I did. And then the third scholarship is for a university, a full scholarship for someone to get a graduate degree, a PhD, or even an undergrad. Now, Thailand didn't have that, but some other countries do, such as Taiwan. In studying international business, the Fulbright does cover, I believe, 3 years worth of studies. So those are the 3 tracks that you can choose from. And the teaching English, remember, that requires the TOEFL. I think I got those letters. The teaching English as a foreign language test or certification to be able to do that. And then the other 2, the research, and then the higher education.
And this is not just for students. Fulbright also has scholarships for faculty and staff.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about Fulbright again. And this is Rachel, sorry. Now, funny, my partner just mentioned to me, now my partner is currently a Gallaudet student, and they were saying, hey, maybe I should do that. Maybe, maybe I could go out. But the Fulbright, honestly, it opened many, many doors for me. And seriously, on job applications, I guarantee that's going to stand out that you are a Fulbright scholar. And someone asked me, really? And I said, yeah. And they said, tell me more. Because the name of Fulbright is so very well known, and they know that it really is a powerful and valuable experience. So I love being able to talk to people and chat about my experience, because a lot of people are interested in that and they are curious about that. So the skills that you learn, patience, resilience, being able to make your way through those skills that really relate to the international sphere, apply to the business world as well. So you go and you can come back, and all of a sudden there's your journey.
Right. I wasn't aware of how many doors that name would open. I had heard about Fulbright, and I hadn't really heard about a lot of deaf scholars getting it. But my neighbor was also a Fulbright scholar, which I didn't know. And so I was talking to them about it. I knew that they had disappeared off the face of the earth for about a year. And I didn't realize it was because of Fulbright. They went out to the Philippines. And I learned a lot about some of the Southeast Asian culture from them before going to Thailand. So it's been amazing.
Yeah, this is Jameson. Now, I saw one question that just popped up. Which countries are offered? Is there a list? And to answer that, there's over 125 countries, and there's more information, and Becca just posted the link to that organization and the countries in the chat box. And I think there was one winner before, I think it was Dominican Republic, I think is where they went to just recently, I believe. Yeah. Jarvis, did you want to add something?
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to add about Fulbright is you do go for your program, be it research or teaching, but they also make sure that you have time blocked out, set aside to enjoy the country you're in, enjoy the culinary aspects of the country. There are the Michelin Awards, which are international awards for culinary arts. And the Fulbright gives you a list of what the Michelin restaurants are in that area that you're in. I didn't realize there were going to be so many Michelin restaurants in Thailand. I saw multiple 2- and 3-star restaurants. And the food is super cheap, at least in Thailand it was. And it's this very nice food that's delicacies. And I made sure to go to all of the Michelin restaurants that I could. And that was a great way to learn about Taiwan or Thailand. I did go to a single 5-star Michelin restaurant, and it was street food. It was a cart on the street, not something fancy. And it was the best food I think I've ever had. And I'm a foodie, so I really enjoyed that. I also visited where 007 was filmed while I was there. It's on an island just off of Thailand. Gorgeous swimming. But like I said, my favorite part was trying the food. I gained so much weight, but my goodness, it was worth it. And it was hard coming back to the States. Just, it doesn't taste the same. Even Thai food here doesn't taste the same. What about Italian food, Rachel? Any thoughts? Oh no, not even close. Oh yeah, it's definitely fake. Feels like fake Thailand food.
So somebody just asked, what was your favorite Thai food?
Oh, no way to narrow it down. I love stir fry. There they call them foodles. They're these really fat noodles that are very soft, and they have red pepper that is cut up into them. There's no meat. You can ask them to add that if you want to, chicken or something. But usually it's served as a vegetarian dish that was delicious. There were so many. The coconut soup was delicious and had a very sour bite to it. So many different food options that I loved. I had a very similar food experience to Jarvis. Italian food, I mean, Italy's already famous for their food, right? But then you meet people, you make friends. The family that I stayed with, they knew all of the best restaurants to go to, these little hole-in-the-wall places that you never would have gone as a tourist. And it was just amazing. And I am a fussy eater. There are a lot of things that I won't eat. But when I got to Italy, there was nothing I wouldn't try. I wanted to respect their culture. I wanted to try everything. So I didn't say no. And I ended up loving all of it. And when I got back to the United States, I went back to eating almost everything like I had in Italy, and it just wasn't the same. And I, like Jarvis said, I gained weight as well. But I also did a lot of touristy things, swimming, skiing. The host family really supported a lot of the logistics and took care of almost everything I need. I felt fully supported the entire time I was there. Never felt like I was thrown to the wolves or on my own. And even like I said, in my time, I still felt that way, even though I could only communicate with my family through fax in the United States. I thought I might feel like I was deaf or alone in this new country, traveling by myself, riding the railroad cars, didn't know what it was going to look like. But it was so easy to communicate with everyone. It went much smoother than I expected. And I really do thank Fulbright for all of their support. And if you want to travel, Fulbright's the way to go.
So we have another question that just popped up. This is for Jarvis. And Becca is asking, I know that you have an orientation in DC before you go to Thailand, but what support does Fulbright provide to deaf students or during orientation? Did you meet other students during orientation?
That's a good question. Thailand did not have any in-country orientation. It didn't even have any in the US. I asked, and there were some available for other countries. But when I got to Thailand, there was I thought there would be a one-day orientation. That's what I was told. What it ended up being, the program director, Ben, and I had a one-on-one when I got there. And during that orientation, if you call it that, they helped me set up the bank account, get my phone connected, and everything worked out. It was a really good experience for me. It was sort of an odd situation, though, because Fulbright is under the State Department here in the United States. That's where the funding comes from. But in other states, other countries, it's different. And you got to learn what laws, American laws, still apply because you're there under government funds. Department of State, as a government agency, means we have to follow American and US laws while we're there in country, which is why Fulbright provides interpreting services because of ADA law. But in the Thailand field office, this was their first time ever having worked with a deaf scholar. So I would have to contact the State Department, get the accommodations office here in the United States, have them provide the guidelines to the office in Thailand because they said it wasn't their responsibility for interviews and things like that. Anytime we had trainings or orientations all day, I would need an interpreter, and they weren't aware of this. Their English wasn't that good, and it was a bit of an experience working it out with them. But the State Department came around and did provide those guidelines. They ended up working it out way above my head. And when I got there, we had Thailand interpreters with International Sign Language, a certified deaf interpreter that would come in and work with me. They really struggle. Unlike Rachel had a great experience in Italy gesturing with hearing people. It was very different when with Eastern culture. Even in Thailand Sign Language, they really struggled. But these were barriers that we eventually broke down and got through. Yeah, the three of us who were chosen for Fulbright was me, Susan Ding, who's hearing, who's a staff member at Gallaudet, and Paul Dudis, who's the chair of the linguistics department now, and well, interim interpreting department chair. And we went with Audrey. I'm roommates with Audrey, so we all had great experiences that time. It was amazing. Audrey wasn't there on Fulbright, but came with Paul Dudis. So we had a lot of fun there together. And Jarvis, I'd have to say you're right. In terms of access and interpreting, it was very nice that Fulbright worked that out for us. There were a few people that I ran into that were aware about interpreting services. Some knew ASL, some knew Italian Sign Language, so they would use both. Paul presented at a hearing linguistics conference while we were there in Italy, so they worked out using International Sign Language, ASL, and LEAS. So some of the hoops that they jumped through to make it accessible for us were amazing. But as I said, that was the full support of Fulbright the entire time I was there.
Nice, nice. We had another question that's just popped up. Typically, studying away and abroad, how many months? 9, 10? It really depends on the researcher. 9 to 12 months is what it is, though.
Well, but then you can apply for another 6-month extension. So you can do the 10 months and up to a 6-month extension. That's not guaranteed. It could be denied. But when you're accepted, you're guaranteed 10 months worth of support with the option to extend. I'm trying to remember, mine was a long time ago. I left when school ended in May, and then I came back in October. But again, like I mentioned, that month of August, Europe is basically closed, so I didn't do a lot of research that month. It was mostly vacation. I don't know if Thailand has something similar to that, where they all take a month off. Well, their school system is very different than the United States. They're off 2 months in the fall. That's what they equate to their summer break. And they go straight through the summer that we have off.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mentioned we took the train to Sicily. And just so you know, I'm not a geographic expert. I didn't realize that Italy has a peninsula and water that runs right through it. I thought it was all one piece of land. And I believe the train was overnight. There was no direct connection. And we sort of slept in the bunk cars, and that was an interesting feeling. There was a part of the evening where the train slammed on their brakes. I felt like they must have dropped a hook or something to stop us. And it was very weird. A lot of people were very upset with how the train stopped. We thought that we may have been in a collision or something. We weren't sure. It was just dreadful, dreadful break. But it was very interesting to see. I couldn't see out the window what had happened. And as I said, it was overnight. In the morning, everything was okay when we got there. The family came back to pick me up, and I told them about this jolt and stop, and they were floored that they had missed it. What they were doing is unloading boats from the cars into the canal. And so people got off the train and walked about while they were doing that. The people under and to the side of me decided to sleep through it, but it was just beautiful. The scenery, the food, the drinks. I didn't know that I was missing out on that when they stopped to unload the boats. If I had known, I would have gotten up and enjoyed it, but it's a very unique experience. Because Sicily was an island, so it wasn't a direct connect. Like I said, they had to load us onto the trains to go across the canal.
So does the audience have any further questions?
Ugh, this camera. There, like I said, this was 23 years ago, but I still remember some of the signs that I learned. I went back in 98, and then I got called back in 2000 for more workshops and training. And I've stayed in touch with, I'm still in touch with some of the people that I met while I was there. I've made lifelong friends through this experience. I thought it would be a period of my life, but it's not been. It's become my life. My Italian mom and dad have kind of become like my step parents, and I really do feel like I made some family there, and brothers even. It's been a lifelong impact. Yeah, I just got back not too long ago, but I'm expecting the same thing from my experience. The World Federation for the Deaf in November of 2021, next year, hopefully we're done with the pandemic, is there. I would like to go. They've already reached out to me. So that would be great, a great excuse to get back to Thailand. And you develop a network, really. Like you said, your neighbor, you've had that very quick connection. It's become a lifelong journey that I didn't expect.
So there's a question. What were your favorite cities, both of you? Bangkok, for Jarvis, or maybe for Rachel, Rome, Venice, or Sicily?
Really, Bangkok wouldn't be in my top few, but because of the university and the network they have, Bangkok is where I spent most of my time. It's very large. I can't remember exactly how many people live there, but it's a very crowded city. I think it's more than Los Angeles, last I heard, which surprised me. But it's a city. It's dirty, like you would see here in America, like New York, but there's so much to do in terms of nightlife. But I wouldn't say it's one of my top. If I were to pick, I would say Chiang Mai. The people there were super friendly. Next to, it's the third largest city. There is a deaf school there, and I went and visited and just fell in love with the city. The university there is pretty cool as well. Chiang Mai was this city. I wasn't really able to do my research there because there weren't as many stakeholders. It's a much smaller association, so I had to go to Bangkok, where I actually ended up doing my research. Also in outlying cities, the monks at 5 a.m. do a parade of donations. And so people donate to the monks during their morning parade, and that's how the monks survive, and that's how they take care of themselves, because of those donations.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a hard thing to answer. If I had to choose, I mean, just all of Italy. It's a beautiful country. The people in the different areas that I mentioned are very different. The north is a lot more like Germany and Switzerland. They're far more punctual. On the Thai, it's more business-like, but southern Italy is just folks that are super calm, more frilly type dressing as opposed to the suits. Also, like I said, the sign language was different. Spoken sign language in Italy is over 300 years old, but if you look at the written and spoken language, it varies. All of the schools and politics use Roman Italian, but there's like 300 different languages or something like that, but for political reasons, they've chosen to go with Roman Italian, and so a lot of those smaller, more niche languages have started to disappear. Men and women go to separate schools. So deaf Italian men and deaf Italian women had different sign languages when they would meet after their schooling. So as they got older, that started to become standardized. And it's just crazy the amount of variances that you have in Italian. But to my favorite city, if I had to pick, it would be Roma or Rome. But Roma was definitely my favorite city. Just the history there, the Colosseum is beautiful. And it's breathtaking when you see it. I couldn't describe it. If I had to go back and I could only visit one city, I would make sure that it was Rome.
Nice.
I know he also mentioned Milan. Isn't the school for the deaf there in Milan or well, I mean, if you think about the Milan Conference where they voted to support oralism in deaf education, that happened there. So there is a school for the deaf. There's several throughout Italy, and I visited many of them. Unfortunately, many of them have shut down over the last however many years. But it was a really fun experience. They have IEP meetings similar to ours, so I got to talk with the parents. We talked with Schwipt, which is the head of the school there, about sign language and education and how that developed in Italy. And so I was able to support them a lot through that. But it really has a huge impact on these children's future. Having that language access is vital.
And, you know, I think now's a good time to wrap up. So once again, I want to say thank you, Jarvis and Rachel, for your time, for being on this panel and explaining your experience as a Fulbright Scholar. I want to thank our voice interpreters for making this as for our event and all of our attendees. So Go Global Week is not done. We do have more events tomorrow, and tomorrow, Wednesday's event is 5 to 6:30. And the topic will be Go Global, Find a Path. It will make you who you are as a person in international development and as an international development student. We're going to have a panel and a special guest speaker and also activities. So we hope to see you there tomorrow.
Thank you all so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Also, if you do have any questions that you think of later, feel free to reach out to me, or I'm sure Rachel as well, and we're more than happy to answer that.
Right, and if you're interested or curious about the Fulbright process and the scholarship, contact Becca. She can give you plenty of advice.
Yeah, Becca was a huge help to me going through the application process.
Yep, it's good.
Just so you know, my last name is Harris, Rachel Harris at Gallaudet.edu. I'm more than happy to talk with anyone about this.